Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're hailing from. Welcome to another edition of Ask an OpenShift Admin. I am Chris Short, executive producer of OpenShift TV, and I am joined by the one and only Andrew Sullivan. Andrew, we have a special guest on today. Please introduce yourself and our guest.
We do. So thank you, Chris, and looking forward to today's show. It was fortunately our guest, Catherine Dubé, who is a product manager with OpenShift, was very gracious and very accommodating because I asked her very, very last minute yesterday afternoon if she was able to join. So
I think you DM'd me at like 6 o'clock last night. Yeah, Catherine's going to be on the call.
Yeah, something like that. So I thank you in advance. Before I even introduce you, Catherine, thank you in advance. So this is the Ask an OpenShift Admin Office Hour. It is one of the Office Hour series of live streams here on OpenShift.tv. So what that means is that we are here to answer any of the things that are on your minds, right? Whatever it is that is bothering you, that comes to mind, whatever questions you happen to have. You've got three experts here. Catherine is somebody that I rely on pretty heavily to help answer questions, to reassure me that I am either right or wrong, as the case may be. So if we don't know the answer, we are more than happy to go and find the answer, whether that means reaching back into the rest of the product management team, reaching into engineering, finding those relevant people to find those or get those answers for you. That being said, in the absence of questions from you all, we are very happy to have today's guest, Catherine Dubé, and today's topic, which is revisiting the installer and the install process. So if you recall, last year, kind of some of the first episodes that we did here of the Ask an OpenShift Admin live stream, back when it was called the OpenShift Admin Office Hours, we talked about installers. We talked about the install process. We kind of did a bit of a deep dive down into that and all of the different things that are going on inside of there. But of course, things change. There's been some new things. There's been some old things that have changed, if you will. So we wanted to revisit that because it's important to keep up with what's going on and make sure you're aware of all of the options that are available out there. And quite literally, I could not think of a better subject matter expert or a better person to come on and talk about this than Catherine. So Catherine, if you will, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine Dubé. I am part of the OpenShift product management team. My focus is on installation and updating of OpenShift. Yay.
All right. So we'll get to that in just a moment. We'll talk about the install process. We'll talk about a day in the life of Catherine, which is I'm sure even more chaotic than Chris and I. But first, in longstanding tradition, the things that are top of mind, things that have come up recently that I want to highlight and make sure that you all are aware of. So this was a relatively quiet week. Red Hat had a holiday over the weekend, so it was quiet. I'm going to treat that as a good thing, right? As administrators, if it's quiet, that means everything is running smoothly. I don't know if I think it was Futurama, right, where Bender was the you've done it right if nobody thinks you've done anything at all, right? That's a good administrator, right? If everybody goes, "What's that guy doing here?" That means that nothing's broken. That's a good thing. So a couple of things. So I got asked. This comes up periodically around the in-tree VMware storage provisioner. So when we deploy a cluster that is Vsphere integrated, so Vsphere IPI, Vsphere UPI, we configure the in-tree storage provisioner. And that provisioner, if you look in the upstream docs, supports some things or is capable of doing some things that OpenShift doesn't support or is not capable of doing. So things like multi-DRS cluster, multi-Vcenter. Importantly, things like storage DRS clusters. So I saw at least one example this week where the customer I think they did a UPI install, and they were able to successfully deploy using a data store cluster. However, what happened is storage DRS did what storage DRS does. It moved one of the disks for a virtual machine, and it caused a ripple of things to happen, not the least of which was there was a bunch of PVs that wouldn't connect because it lost track of where they were at. So please be aware, please be conscious of, if you have a DRS cluster, storage DRS cluster, that you don't want to use that for OpenShift deployments. You want to use just a standard data store for that.
Cool.
The second thing that I had was, somebody sent me an email. So one of our IBM compatriots sent me an email asking about examples for deploying the registry and using storage, non-default storage or other storage that is configured. So we were chatting about this before the show started, and Catherine very kindly corrected me in that when the cluster is, after the cluster is deployed, the registry operator kind of detects what infrastructure it's on and then configures the storage appropriate for that. And Catherine, I'm going to help to keep me honest here. So basically, if it says, hey, I'm on Azure, it does things like talks to the credential mentor and says, hey, please give me some, Azure object storage or whatever storage credentials so I can request my PVC or connect to that object storage, and then goes through and configures all of that. But what if I want to do something different? How can I do that? So I'm going to work on, and I've got some background things going on. Hopefully next week I'll be able to talk about and show some of those examples. I'm also going to work on a blog post for OpenShift.com where we can talk about that.
Cool.
So.
Yeah. So the way it works, just really quick, not to spend too much time on it, but yeah, when any of the OpenShift components that require cloud API access, they will request a credentials request. That essentially is what gives them enough credentials to go create the resources that it needs. So in the case of Azure, since you brought that up, that would be its own storage account. So from there, once it has the permissions, it can then request what it needs for the registry, and then that gets created as part of the operator itself. Hopefully that provides the right level of detail you're looking for.
That's great. Thank you. So the last thing that I have is something that just came out this morning. It was shared by Chris and I's teammate, Eric Jacobs, who also has a live stream or 2 or 5 on here.
Yeah.
So Eric has been working in conjunction with Kirsten Newcomer and a handful of other folks around updating what we call the Red Hat OpenShift Container Platform Architecture Design Guide for PCI DSS, which is a huge mouthful.
Yeah.
Effectively, if you are a customer who is interested in or has PCI DSS requirements, this is meant to help you with that architecture process, right? How do I design, deploy, manage my OpenShift deployment within those constraints? So I posted the link to that into the chat there. Be sure to check it out. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or Chris. Andrew.Sullivan@redhat.com, Chris.Short@redhat.com.
No, it's just C Short.
Oh, C Short.
Yeah,
that's right.
We were talking about. Yeah, sorry.
Anyway, it's Chris Short on Twitter, but C Short on email. I'll get.
I mean, like if I went about and created like a consistent handle across all platforms, people wouldn't know where I am anymore. So
yeah, we're only. This is what, episode 25. Yeah, we're only at 25 episodes in. Maybe in another 25, I'll get it.
Yeah, eventually.
All right. So I see there's a couple of questions already. So I think we should go ahead and address those, and then we can, go from there. And again, please, at any time, feel free to ask any questions that you have, whether or not they're related to today's topic. So, the installer is today's topic, but don't let that inhibit you. So the first one from, let's see, Rahul. I have to migrate from OpenShift 3 to 4. Could you please share any reference links? So Chris, I see you shared the migration topic link there. I think that's a good one.
Yeah.
So we do have a number of migration tools, not the least of which is the migration toolkit for containers.
That's what I was thinking of. And
Yep.
I couldn't remember the name of.
So basically you stand up the new cluster, you point, I think it gets deployed to the new cluster, and then you point it at the old cluster and say, hey, migrate all this stuff for me.
And it's meant to just did a stream on that with storage. So you can do this with storage. You can do this with just about anything. Drop the link in chat there to actually that's the wrong link. Ugh.
Yeah, as I spent a little bit of time yesterday planning out episodes for the rest of this quarter. So I think I'm going to tack that migration topic onto the end. So hopefully sometime in June, we'll be able to cover that here on this show.
Okay.
Let's see. Another question we had from Dean. If I use the assisted installer with bare metal, how can I add a new node post installation? So Catherine, I'll kick this one over to you, even though I know assisted installer is kind of parallel to what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to elaborate on that, please do.
So let me maybe just ask the question one more time there, so I understand what the.
So how do you add a node to a assisted installed cluster?
Yep.
Yeah, I believe so. So it actually can be done a couple different ways. I believe Assistant Installer itself, you could, and this isn't something I'm involved with, but I'll sort of, fumble through it as best as I can. I believe you can still use the bootable assets under, or whatever they call it, the boot media, I guess is the right term.
ISO that they give you,
Yeah. So you can still stand up nodes and add them in that way, but you actually really don't have to. It's an OpenShift cluster at the end of the day. All you really need to know is booting of the operating system and where to go get the ignition. And the ignition is always hosted on the master nodes. So there's a ignition boot service that you can leverage. So it's no different from whether you do it on day 1 or you do it on day 27. It doesn't make a difference, right?
Right.
But that's the typical method, and that works across any of the installation types. So not just in assisted installer, not just UPI, IPI. It could be done any different way. So you can manually add nodes in an IPI cluster. You can use machine sets, but essentially all it really is you're passing a user data field to that node, which is a location where to go get its ignition config. So depending on the node's role. Whether it's a worker or a master, in a case of if you had to replace a control plane node, you would boot with that ignition. That in turn would then work on joining the cluster, and then you'll need to approve the CSRs for that node, which essentially is their certificates, the client and server certificates to be able to securely communicate.
So just kind of to rewind that back, it sounds almost as easy as using the assisted installer, minus the fact you have to go manually approve CSRs.
Yeah, you still have to do it in the case, especially of a bare node cluster, because you don't really know that the node itself belongs in the cluster. We get a little smarter with some of the cloud providers where we can say, well, hey, we kind of guess you are because we know you're, on this cloud infrastructure, you're the networks that you're running on, or is the network you should be on. So there's things it looks at to do the auto approval, whereas sort of bare metal is a little more challenging. There's not quite as much information there to gather.
Right. Yeah. Dean says using the assisted installer, he doesn't have to deal with ignition files. Which,
right.
Yeah, they're still there. They're just invisible to you, which is one of the nice things about that.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. I think the original name of assistant installer, maybe to kind of paint a different picture on it, was UPI was the original name, and they call it assistant installer. So the way I describe UPI to people is user provision infrastructure is essentially like no installation, right? There's no installer. You're just getting all the necessary artifacts that you need to bring up a cluster. But from there, you're responsible for provisioning everything, right?
Right.
With IPI, obviously, that's full stack automation. That means it's provisioning everything for you. It automatically just comes up and you have a running cluster. So assistant installer is really kind of the middle of the road, right? Where you have the notion of, boot media or ISOs, those nodes boot up. They essentially establish identity by connecting back to the service, and then you form a cluster based on where you're sort of running those images. So it makes it a lot easier as opposed to manually having to go to each node and sort of provision it.
Right.
So again, anyway.
Yeah. Awesome. So I noticed there you answered, or probably out of habit at this point, what I can only imagine is your most frequently asked and answered question, which is the difference between IPI and UPI. So I have I guess two questions related to that. So one, from your perspective, are there advantages or disadvantages to one install method versus the other? And then the second part, or the follow on to that, is there a difference in the cluster that gets provisioned right at the end of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Definitely, I think there's a large perception that UPI is inferior to IPI. I would argue the other direction. IPI is probably more inferior to UPI in the fact that it's a bit more prescriptive, right? We try to, get the 80, I think the best way to describe it is the 80% use case, like the 80% of customers, what they're intending to use for options and settings on their deployment, we cover as part of that automated installation process. Whereas UPI really sort of opens the door to, I want to do customizing of the infrastructure. And this is sometimes what people get confused. They equate it to customizing of the install of OpenShift. It's actually customizing of the infrastructure that OpenShift runs on. So the resulting cluster itself doesn't necessarily have to be different. And well, the docs sort of explain it to maybe the far extreme of you manually provision everything, including your nodes, your control plane nodes, and everything else. It actually doesn't have to. So you can still use some of the IPI functionality in a UPI cluster, and you can actually do it on day one. For example, say you wanted to do machine set creation. We actually generate those as part of the installation or OpenShift manifests, even on a UPI cluster. So it's up to the admin to want to apply those and use those. So they can actually be done in advance of creating a physical node like you would do in a normal UPI process. You could actually instead apply the machine sets, and then the cluster would go off and provision in the case where there is a machine API provider available for the platform you're deploying on. So the case would be like VMware or AWS or GCP or Azure, etc. So you can make those clusters look nearly identical, I would say. There's probably some small, really tiny differences, but not enough from an operational perspective. These clusters will perform identically. You can have elastic and dynamic compute capacity, same way you can do an IPI. And you get the advantage of being able to customize the infrastructure in cases where you wouldn't be able to do this with IPI. And there's a lot of cases where that may be more beneficial to do it in UPI and sort of script it for your organization, as opposed to trying to make IPI fit a model that it's really not intended for.
Yeah, I know. And one of the things I want to follow up with you on in a couple of minutes here is, you and I, we tend to answer a lot of questions, with the field and with customers around the installation process. And a lot of times that bleeds over into architecture. So I definitely want to talk about that a little bit. So Dean has a question here, which you kind of partially answered. So why do we consider UPI to be superior when IPI allows automatically scaling nodes using effectively an OC command? And whereas with UPI, he's saying you have to do your own automation, which I see Christian and Chris are chatting down below saying that that's not true. And you said the same thing. And then kind of the second one, which is tangentially related, which ACM requires IPI clusters, IPI deployed clusters.
Yeah, so the reason for that has to do with the provisioning technology under the covers. So ACM doesn't require IPI. It requires IPI to be able to provision a cluster, but it doesn't require IPI to adopt a cluster. So you could still do a UPI deployment, adopt that deployment for management through ACM. It's only when you want ACM to provision the underlying cluster that you would need IPI. And the reason for that has to do with the integration of how it's provisioned. So it's actually, it integrates through a service called OpenShift Hive, which is a API for provisioning clusters. Now, as part of that, for that service to work, it needs to know how to provision the underlying infrastructure. And this is where I know sometimes maybe people struggle a little bit as why one is better than the other. In cases where you need that additional customization of the infrastructure, Hive or anything else isn't going to know how to do it, right? You're going to be your own admin, your own sort of controller of how you want that to look like, what shape, what size, whatever. And that's where, you could still look at automating the provisioning. Like a good example is, say you're on AWS, we provide CloudFormation templates that will pretty much, you follow, one by one, there's 6 stacks, you would get a running functioning cluster. But do you really need to have 6 CloudFormation stacks? No, actually not. You could tie it into all different, one script with a couple questions, and it would look just like IPI at the end of the day. You'd have an identical cluster. You can absolutely do that. So that's the case where you really need that customization. And that's why it won't work with ACM, is because it doesn't know that special infrastructure customization. It only works with kind of like, here's kind of the 80% use case with IPI, and here's, if you can adhere to this, then we can go provision it, because we know how to do that as part of the regular installation process.
So I'm going to take some questions a little out of order here. So
Yeah.
Ricky, I see your question. I'll get to that in just a moment, because and then
multiple answers there.
Yeah, and then JP Dades, I see you chatting about some things as well. So we'll address those. So just to kind of round out or complete the thought process here with Dean. So first, I'm going to expose my lack of knowledge around ACM. So ACM, Advanced Cluster Manager, I think is the name of it.
Yes.
Yep. So
Advanced Cluster Management.
Is Red Hat's multi-cluster management tool. So effectively, right, it's a management plane where you either create, right, deploy, as Catherine was saying, or join existing OpenShift clusters into that management plane. And then you can do things like manage, right, apply security policies, apply RBAC, et cetera, across all of those member clusters. So kind of walking through, with that set. Dean here is saying things like cluster pooling are coming out that will require IPI. I'm not familiar with ACM's roadmap.
I don't think ACM requires IPI. It requires like you have to install that ACM node, what they call the node or the hub. That has to be installed in an IPI fashion. But after that, you can add additional clusters that are not IPI.
Well, I'm assuming what he's saying here is that ACM has a feature called cluster pooling that will use IPI. And what Dean's building here is a case, I guess, against Catherine's statement that UPI is the superior method, which I will say that I agree, but it's like a 51% to 49% agree. I agree because the flexibility and the scalability, particularly, or I should say the simplicity around UPI, I find to be better, particularly the load balancer aspect. Right? Yes, there's an integrated load balancer that comes with IPI. It is fairly limited, both in scale as well as in configuration. Whereas with UPI, you can configure that however you like, in whatever manner you want. And still add machine sets day 2 to be able to get the cluster auto scaling. So I'll take a step back now. Catherine, if do you have any thoughts? Do you have anything to add there?
Yeah. You started hitting the nail on the head with that one. So the reason why I still stand by that comment is IPI is good for a certain prescriptive use case. And I would say we're trying to get better in expanding that out. And I think the metrics we've sort of seen on who's using what, whether UPI versus IPI, we're starting to see definitely an uptick in IPI. Don't get me wrong, we want people to use IPI. It's a lot more, it's a lot easier process, right? So I'm not trying to argue there, but if you look at terms of what you can do with one versus the other one, UPI is actually the more superior one. You can pretty much do anything you want. A good example is, so not just the built-in internal load balancer and DNS functionality that we have with IPI, especially for all the on-premise ones. But even in the cloud, you run into the same scenario. So say, for instance, you have a case where a customer wants to extend an on-premise networking service like for DNS. The way we do IPI today is Route 53 on AWS or nothing, right? So you sort of don't have that option. And that's where on AWS with UPI, you'd be able to do that. So I think that's where a lot of the differences are. One is like, we give you, what's the term? We give you the bullets, we give you the gun, and we let you use it any way you want. Whereas IPI, we put one in the chamber and we point the gun. So we make sure you don't get hurt with it. So that's a big difference in kind of how you can do it. One is pretty much the flexibility to do anything you want, with the risk of it's, could be a lot more complex, or it can be, sort of is as custom as you want. I guess, customization adds complexity, right? Just as a sort of fundamental statement. Whereas we look at IPI as sort of the most robust, near reliable, almost perfect way to get a cluster 100% of the time. But we limit what you can do as part of that initial bring up. And then everything else that doesn't fit, and this is probably another majorly important distinction, is installation in OpenShift 4 has really gotten a lot more simplistic. We purposely prevent a lot of options from getting in the installer on day one, and we push those to day two. And the only really sort of guidelines we have is that, this feature is prolific, like everyone wants it. The second thing is it's unsafe to change on day two, or it's required for installation on day one. So we're very strict on that. But as such, you don't have that infrastructure customization flexibility you get with UPI. Hopefully that was not too long-winded.
So I want to poke on that just a little bit of, I know we've discussed, here on the Ask an Admin live stream before of, with the change from OpenShift 3 to OpenShift 4, we went from Ansible playbooks that had, I think somebody told me 1,200 plus options that you could set in the values.yaml or preferences or whatever it was, right? To OpenShift install in version 4, where the install config, you can customize it to some degree, right? OpenShift install explain is your friend. I love that command because you can go through and you can see all of the different options and all the things that you can configure. But it might be 100 options total across all of the infrastructures, all of the different things that you can do. And I think you really highlighted that of the result of OpenShift install is the cluster being up and running and ready to do all of those other things, which was, probably 1,100 of those 1,200 options in version 3 for doing things like, configuring all of these little cluster add-ons and minutia and all of that other stuff. And with 3, it was unless all of it succeeds, none of it succeeds. Whereas with 4, if the cluster install succeeds, great, you've got a running cluster. And now you can go through that, hopefully not, but potentially iterative process of deploying all those add-on services. So, and where I'm going with all of that is we sometimes get asked, and Catherine, you and I have had these conversations before, like partners will ask, well, hey, I want to add, and customers as well, I want to add maybe, configuring my load balancer, my external load balancer as a part of the installer, right? I want OpenShift install. I want there to be a stanza for my F5. So it'll go out and configure the F5. Can we add that? Why can't we do that type of stuff? I appreciate your thoughts, your perspective on that.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I don't know that it was 1,200, but if it is, that's awesome. I know it's many hundreds. Put it that way. So that was always the thing. I think a lot of this, I sort of inherited the installer midway through 3.x days, so can't necessarily blame anyone, or I don't want to shift the blame to anyone, but it was always that one more option. If it was just one more option, I'd have the cluster the way we wanted it for this customer. And what we did is a lot of snowflakey things where it was unique, special, really wasn't generally applicable, but that one customer had that option. It was all written in Ansible. Everyone could change it. They could submit PRs. So it ended up kind of getting to this point where the reliability suffered a lot because of permutation of different options, and then which ones could be put in the different combination would cause different results. So that was a pretty tricky problem. And as we get to 4, we've been strict. One of the things that we don't allow is any flags whatsoever. I think there's probably like 2 flags in the whole installer. I know, minus dir is to get the directory. I want to say there's 1 or 2 other like log level and things like that, but there's very little. And we've gotten the factions that, we could just parameterize it. We'll just put a bunch of tags or flags, and we'll be able to just run it without changing anything. We're like, but that's not the API, right? So I think we've been very strict on this, and it's shown from the reliability perspective, from the CI that we've got in place. When you run this command and you basically fill out all the options, you're getting a cluster, right? And unless it's something, broke or permissions, or, we're trying to check more and more and more validation on this environment. So I won't say we're 100% perfect, but it's significantly more reliable. So we've sort of shifted the problem now from day one to understanding how you configure Kubernetes on day two. And that's always been a struggle, right? Because we sort of looked at a knob, bell and whistle. It makes it easier on day two, but we've sort of broke the installer by making it more complex. So that's been a little bit of a struggle, getting people to think more Kubernetes-like, more config maps, more manifests. You can still do a lot of that. You can still add those in day one, create manifests. So we do have that option. So anything on OC apply, right? We can make it happen. If you wanted more than one machine set, if you wanted infras on day one, everyone argues it can't be done. And I'm like, yeah, actually it can be done. You just got to create the manifest. So we've sort of given the approach, but we've moved it from a flag or a field to a Kubernetes way of doing it. And I think that aligns a lot more with how customers are doing config management with ACM or GitOps types of situations for policy enforcement. So these are the things that I think we just need to kind of shift our mindset from, having a bell and whistle or a knob or a flag to really thinking in Kubernetes, how do we do that? And that's been, I think, the biggest challenge, but I think people are starting to come around to it. And I think as we see more and more environments roll out, we see the GitOps types of deployments where they want to be able to just, check some PRN and, be able to push out a config and make their cluster declaratively conform to what they've defined it to be.
Yeah, and I think the popularity of Christian's live stream, the GitOps happy hour, which is happening tomorrow, by the way, shows that we as a Kubernetes using industry are maturing, right, and adapting and adopting many of these new philosophies. Like any new technology, it takes a little while. Okay, so I'm going to go back and revisit some of those questions that we were talking about before.
I'm so lost now.
So apologies for anybody who's chatted anything in about the last 5 minutes, because I've been holding the chat in my screen just where Ricky asked his question, which is, I would like to host multiple nodes for students to access remotely. Is there a high-level roadmap on how I could accomplish this with OpenShift? And I think roadmap here is not like roadmap futures, but like how can I do this type of thing? So Ricky, first, a couple of things. When you say nodes, are you referring to OpenShift clusters? In which case, the simplest thing to do would be to use the IPI installer against like Azure or AWS or Google or one of the public clouds and just spin up clusters. And then at the end of that install process, it'll spit out the connection endpoints and credentials, and you can just hand those over to your students and let them do what they do. Alternatively, if it's a shared environment, essentially, spin up a cluster somewhere that's publicly accessible, again, AWS, Azure, etc. And then deploy that cluster, connect in, and then use something simple like HT password authentication and give each one of those users a set of credentials that they can access the cluster with, entitle them, or give them permissions to whatever it is that they need permissions to, and kind of go from there. So the other scenario that I might be possible, or that I might be thinking of here is, maybe you want to give them something that's lighter weight than a full, 5 or 6 node cluster. In which case code-ready workspaces, or code-ready containers would be the answer for that.
Mm-hmm.
So either helping them to deploy that locally to whatever resources they have, or potentially deploying that onto something that they can publicly access. So I don't know, maybe it's not, Packet is no longer Packet, it's now Equinix.
Equinix Metal.
Yeah. So, renting a server from them, deploying a number of instances inside of there, and then handing over credentials for that is another way to potentially do that. Catherine, Chris, anything to add there?
Yeah, we've got the other option is if it's just like a student case, you could use Hive. You could leverage a hub and spoke model, deploy Hive in your hub, and then provision through cluster deployments, additional clusters as they're needed. Again, I'm not sure if it's clusters or nodes in the question, but that is another option, and that's fairly minimal to do in terms of using Hive.
Good to know. I need to learn more about Hive.
Yeah, same here. Like I
It's
dug
it's
into
an
it.
API.
So JP Dade, can we do UPI for vSphere with Windows worker nodes and OVN Kubernetes networking? So I don't think this is an installer limitation. It's a Windows Wimco. What is it? It's the Windows machine config operator.
Yep.
I always think Windows Media for some reason, which is not the same thing.
Yeah, maybe.
So I don't think that's an installer limitation. I think it's a Windows nodes, Windows machine config operator limitation there.
I thought they're pretty close to that. I know the BYO Windows isn't quite there yet. I think that's coming soon though.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought the VMware support sort of like think like a machine set type of deployment where you're spinning up your own Windows. I thought that's just about available or was already available.
IPI it works. That's GA. I think it's GA.
Yeah. The BYO is still, I think, a release away, if I recall.
Yeah, Christian says it's in version 2.0.next. So thank you for spending some time on chat during your workout, Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, scrolling down here, I know there was some others, so I'm going to take just a second to read through the chat. Does the installer, Rapscallion Reeves, does the installer allow for mixed IPI and UPI deployments? If not, is there an easy-ish way to add manual UPI nodes to an IPI cluster?
So no. I'm just trying to figure out which way we're asking this, whether we were trying to automate a UPI install or try to go the other way around. We're doing an IPI and then adding manual nodes.
I think what he's asking is, can I deploy with IPI and then add manually provision nodes as day two?
Right.
You can. Biggest caveat is they must be on the same platform that you've deployed the cluster on. One exception is, so let me just maybe take that one step further.
Yeah.
If you're on AWS and you want to put a bare metal node manually joining the cluster, that won't work. But if you did a platform agnostic install where you didn't pick up a cloud provider, so think in the install config platform none, would essentially allow you to mix any which way you want to mix, right? The downside is you wouldn't enable any of the platform integration. So you wouldn't be able to do auto scaling, you wouldn't be able to do dynamic storage, you wouldn't be able to, provision the underlying infrastructure, all that. So pretty much any IPI method wouldn't work in that situation. But you could do it if it's within the same platform. So you could do a manual machine addition in the same platform. What you would end up doing is you would have to be able to get, there is a URL for the ignition config for a worker on the masters, and I have to look up exactly where it is, but I think it's even covered in the docs somewhere. You would pass it in through user data depending on the platform you add, whether it's hosted in a web server somewhere or, again, using it off the cluster, which is probably the easiest way to do it. You would then boot that node, and when it's adjoined, it would be a single worker node on its own.
So essentially, so this is an interesting one, and it's not one that I think off the top of my head, I would have said no to this. But effectively, it's the same as a UPI and then adding machine sets day two, just in reverse. So you're adding nodes that wouldn't be a member of a machine set, but would be a part of a machine config pool. And you're just following the exact same process.
Yep.
So that's good to know. So I'll follow on that question, and it might be asked later on. I just haven't gotten there yet. Can you convert between IPI and UPI? Like, can I deploy IPI and then change that to a UPI cluster, or vice versa?
I think it's one of those trick questions because there's really not any nuance of IPI or UPI within the environment. Think of UPI as user provision infrastructure. So if I user provision the infrastructure, I can obviously do that, right? You can set up all the resources you need to perform a successful deployment of OpenShift. Vice versa, if you use IPI to have the installer provision that on your behalf, you could do that as well. the trick is what are you trying to manage on day two? Like, what are you trying to go from installer provision to user provision? Because the cluster on day two is nearly identical. I want to say 99 and 40 hundredths or ivory soap identical. So you're still going to use a lot of the same operators that would essentially manage resources. A good example is, say, the ingress operator on AWS. It would still be managing the network load balancer for start.apps or ingress. On day two, you could disable that, right? So as part of that operation in the operator, you can disable that. Likewise, you could go to the internal registry and say, I want to use different storage. You could, I'm trying to think of the other thing. You could stop using machine API, so machine sets, right? And do manual nodes. So I think it just depends on what you're trying to change. I don't think it's I'm going to convert a UPI to an IPI or UPI to an IPI. Like, there's not really a notion of that. It just depends on what secondary level services you want to enable or disable.
Got it. Yeah, and I see here, so Usame, apologies for butchering anybody's name. Is it possible to use IPI with an external load balancer at the same time? And I think the inverse is true. And what I was thinking as you were saying that is, we see people ask, can I use the integrated load balancer of IPI with a UPI deployment on premises? And I think what you just said was more or less along the lines of, yeah, deploy IPI and then just don't use the machine sets, to scale nodes.
It's a little trickier in their question. I think what they're probably asking for, and maybe I'm mistaken or reading between the lines here. My guess is like, for instance, they did a VMware install where we would have the keep alive D HA proxy doing load balancing for the cluster. I'm sort of wondering, are they talking about, no, I'd like to really use an F5 after I deploy the cluster?
That's definitely what they're asking. I asked a separate, or I added on to that. So yes, you are answering their question.
So that's the trick. I want to say you probably have the most experience in this, but I'm gonna sort of flubber through it. There's no good way to manage that I'm aware of the internal keep alive D HA proxy setup. I believe it's just you like going through MCO to basically tell it not to work anymore. But I don't recall what other problems that digs up as you do that. I think it's technically possible, and I'm sure someone's probably done it. You probably have some better insight than I do on this.
So to answer your question directly, yes, but no. So what Catherine is saying is true. Technically, you could go in and using MCO, you could basically remove or disable the keep alive D functionality that's associated with the ingress endpoint, and then basically move that virtual IP address or the DNS name associated with it to an F5 or a Citrix or whatever external load balancer you're using. But that goes back to the whole, now you're breaking or deliberately modifying that opinionated, IPI installation process. And should you really be using UPI in that instance? And if you want to continue to do things like automatically scale machine sets, well, great, you can add that day too. So the real answer here is, and the way that doesn't, deliberately break core, IPI functionality, is to simply add a second domain and then point that domain to the external load balancer. So if the default ingress is star.apps, so maybe you have a star.prod or a star. Something, and that's hosted on, I'm going to pick on F5, right? So an F5 load balancer. So when you create your routes, you simply say that they are managed by that external, that second set of route instances, or ingress instances. And then particularly with our partners who have certified operators, words are hard at the moment, certified operators, right? They'll do things like automatically update that external load balancer configuration for additional worker nodes as they get provisioned, right? All of the things that they normally need to do. So it is possible. It's just a little bit different than you might be expecting. Hopefully that answers.
Maybe to take that one step deeper, because I always sort of think sometimes it's a misunderstanding of why we even use this in the first place. So the reason why we have these services as part of the IPI deployment and they're not on the UPI deployment is UPI, we're sort of at that point of assuming you have control of your own, infrastructure. So you're probably going to bring your own DNS, you're probably going to bring your own load balancer. Chances are you have an F5 or something equivalent, since that's what we keep talking about here. But in the case of IPI, we still need a service to automate the bring up of the cluster. So the reason for this has to do with the whole inception problem of how do you bring Kubernetes under management if you don't have Kubernetes running, right? So we have this notion of a bootstrap node, and what that is our temporary control plane. Now, we need to be able to, during the pivot from the temporary control plane to the permanent control plane, which is your 3 control plane nodes that you end up with on a running cluster, is we need to be able to perform tasks against the API server. And at that time, you really don't know where the API server is running. You know it's running somewhere. It's got an API dot, cluster name dot domain name, but you don't really kind of know where it is. So what we use is a load balancer, and it can be performed a couple different ways. You can have a load balancer, with health checks with a bunch of DNS names below it, or you can just use round robin DNS. It really doesn't matter per se on the bootstrapping operation. But what you need to do is when you resolve API, or API int is actually the right one here, you have to be able to get to the right running control plane. So the way we do that is we have the master in there and the 3 masters and the bootstrap node. And depending on where it is in the cycle, someone's going to be responding. So without an on cluster service, we have no way to provision an external service to do that as part of that bring up. So that's sort of our workaround to bringing Kubernetes under management of Kubernetes. It's the whole bootstrap process. And that's why we're leveraging on cluster services for internal communication.
Yeah. So jumping back to some questions, and I'm falling way behind on chat here. My apologies. So Dean has another question that I think is an important one here. Other than not having access to DHCP, what are some of the main oppositions we see customers have against using IPI? And I see some of our other audience members chiming in here with reasons. Waleed saying not knowing the name, right, both of nodes, or I guess of nodes, for compliance and DNS approvals. Let's see, keep alive D plus HA proxy floating IP failover time.
I mean, we have somebody asking in chat about, they have a pool of MAC addresses, and this is the only pool of MAC addresses they're allowed to use. I mean, that's a reason, right? Like,
yeah. So, Catherine, being the product manager, what other things do you see or hear about in that respect?
Yeah, a lot of it. So definitely DHCP is one of them, and this is an argument we get in all the time. The trick with this is it would require a significant retooling of the platform, even if you handed me a bunch of of MAC addresses and say just go fill them out, right? Because everyone's definition of it isn't even just here's a bunch of MAC addresses. Some people say, well, here's a bunch of IP addresses, right? So it's even more specific, but it's really more of the cattle versus pet mentality, right? And I think in some environments, where you're very strict and you can't have DHCP, it's definitely going to be a lot more strict on how you assign things, what you let on the network. So it sort of breaks this paradigm of dynamic compute on capacity, this whole thing that we have with IPI. So that's one of them, and that's a big one. I would say the other one is credentialing could also be sometimes challenging, where they don't want to automate a lot of stuff. They want to make sure that credentials are locked down as hard as they can, and then sort of just give just enough to get a cluster up and running. And the way we do it today, I would say good or bad. I'm not going to sort of defend this, but we require admin credentials for provisioning a lot of the things today. So sometimes that's a little bit of a rub for folks, and I think it's understandable. I don't we're not trying to say otherwise, but we are trying to improve upon that, which will help a number of customers who are using UPI move to IPI. So I think there's definitely some work there, and it's and the other one that I've also seen is sometimes some of the architectures are very restrictive that customers need to work in. Good example is like just throwing GCP out there, for instance. I don't feel like that's got enough face time today. It uses something called, typically customers use something called cross-project networking. Well, it sounds great on paper. You know, you create all this, you create a shared VPC with all your networks in it, and then you share it out to all the other projects or OpenShift in a different project. The issue is that you lock the account that's provisioning OpenShift down from accessing just beyond reading the networks in the shared VPC. So it can't make any changes. You can't update any firewall rules, IAM, whatever. You can't pretty much create anything. So IPI is under the assumption, I'm going to create everything you need to be successful in having a perfectly running cluster out of the box. Well, if you can't create things like firewall rules or you can't your IAM, I mean, you pretty much broke the model. So that's another reason why. Sometimes the restrictive natures of the architectures, by locking things down, prevents automation. And there's really sort of no good way around it. You just don't have the right permissions as the account installing OpenShift.
So we've only got about 8 minutes left, and I think we have a hard stop today, Chris.
We have a very hard stop, yes.
Okay. So I want to do a bit of rapid fire with questions here. So for any questions that we don't answer here on the stream, or if we have an incomplete, I'll make sure to put all of those into the blog post. So okay. Friday morning on openshift.com/blog, just look for the blog post that summarizes this particular episode, and we'll have all of those inside of there. Let's see. Any option to use IPI plus external load balancer other than router sharding? Unfortunately, no. Although I think the assisted installer folks are working on the ability to do something like that. Basically, today when they deploy, they use that integrated keep alive D load balancer functionality. I think I have heard that they are working to be able to add the ability to specify an external load balancer as a part of that. And Catherine, please feel free to jump in and add anything if needed. So if I have nodes on overt/rev, I can't add bare metal nodes.
I've kind of answered this.
Yeah. So
in chat. So.
And this is one, Catherine, again, I see you answer this question all the time. I answer it probably just as frequently, which is, and you've already said this, we can't mix infrastructure types. So if there is, or let me be more specific, if there is a cloud provider, infrastructure provider integration configured, then you can't mix infrastructure types. So if you deployed, say, Vsphere IPI or UPI or Rev IPI or UPI, then you can't add a physical server to that because it would not have the same, cloud provider, infrastructure provider integrations available to it. And therefore Kubernetes, not OpenShift, Kubernetes won't allow it to join the cluster.
Yeah, so maybe just taking that one step further, I think technically you may be able to get away with it in Rev because I don't think they implement a Kubernetes cloud provider yet. This is the one I hate because I hate saying you can, and then if they ever do down the road and it breaks things, everyone's going to be mad and come after me. But the reality why it actually doesn't work, it has to do with the Kubernetes cloud provider. And anyone that implements a node lifecycle controller will essentially think those nodes aren't supposed to be part of the cluster. It'll basically say, hey, you got this foreign node here. I don't know what this is. And it actually removes it, right? So it doesn't know how to deal with the integrations on that. It knows that it's different and unique and special, and it thinks it should never be part of the cluster. So until the Kubernetes itself, as you mentioned, has the notion to ignore node types that are external to the cloud provider you've deployed on, or the provider you've deployed on, it doesn't have to be a cloud provider, but the provider you deployed upon, it will never allow those nodes in the cluster. So it's a physical limitation of Kubernetes. And we get that question all the time. Like, I just want a bare metal node with VMware. I just want a bare metal, like, so anyway.
Rapscallion Reeves. So I see your comments in here about Rev going away in favor of OpenShift virtualization and all of that. Please reach out to me about that. We'll have a conversation about that and what the future holds and how we can help address that. So Andrew.Sullivan@redhat.com or DM me on Twitter, Practical Andrew, and we'll set that up and we can have that conversation. I think I saw the PM for that in the chat here. So I'm sure he's aware, and we'll loop him in as well. Let's see. I'm scrolling through chat quickly, just to make
I'm
sure.
answering the question from Ricky
Okay.
about code and his students' needs.
Okay. So Jose, OpenShift delivers as a ready cluster day 2. Configuration is another level of automation the client needs to map business logic, kind of different. So I think Jose and Christian have been having a conversation around GitOps here. I'm keeping up with trying to keep up with chat.
Argo CD.
Yeah.
That's a good use case.
Youssef, for an IPI installation in Vsphere, is there no option to distribute control plane virtual machines on different ESXi hosts? So that's a question that's come up quite a bit recently. And Catherine, again, please keep me honest here and feel free to add on. So Red Hat created the machine API provider for Vsphere. So if you look in the machine config operator repo, and I'll dig up a link if I can here before the end of the show and post it, and included basically all the functionality there. So today it has no awareness of the underlying cluster topology or settings or features or anything like that. Basically it says, what cluster do you want me, what's the path in the infrastructure, the Vsphere infrastructure, do you want me to deploy these VMs to? And that's what it does. It doesn't reach in and ask, hey, what's the DRS configuration for this cluster or anything like that. I don't know whether or not that's on the roadmap. Honestly, I would be a little surprised if it's on the roadmap. I think there's an RFE for it because that's pretty complex. And I think that different people have different preferences or different desires there, and we don't want to presume, right, what that should be or something like that. But I'll let Catherine speak to that if she has any knowledge there.
Sure. Take the good ones. Yeah. So yes, there actually is an RFE on this. I will tell you there's some technical limitations that need to be fixed right now in the cloud provider. I don't want to sort of blame anyone, but I know that there's a bug there that to be able to use something like, say, multi-cluster, which is what a lot of folks would like to do, and I think it's a good one. So the good reason is scalability. So you don't hit that. There is also the idea of sort of multi Vcenter. Let's just call that a fantasy right now. I think that's one's a little too far out. But the notion of multi-cluster is definitely one that we want to look at. We did do sort of like a POC to figure out if we could do it with UPI, but even UPI isn't going to work because you have to hard code the user name and password of Vcenter in the cloud provider, which is who in their right mind would do that? So that's a bug that needs to be fixed in the upstream before we could even say that we would bless that as a POC. So I think, I hear the question, I hear the ask, it's come up with a number of customers. We want to try to do something, but right now we need to fix some fundamental implementation issues before we can even look at figuring out how we sort of offer that as a deployment method.
Okay, and I'll see if I can dig up the RFE, and I'll include that in the summary blog post as well.
Yeah, so. there's a like I think I want to say like there's 3 RFEs in it, and they all have different desires, so they're not even common among people what they want to do.
Yeah. All right. Well, as Christian just reminded us in chat, we've only got now less than a minute left.
Less than a minute. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for coming on today. I really appreciate you accommodating us short term. I know that this has been a fantastic episode having you here, right, and answering all of these questions to our audience. Thank you so much for all of your questions. I know that we missed a few inside of there. Again, I'll pull out all those questions. We'll make sure to address them in the blog post. So keep an eye on openshift.com/blog. Alex has been getting those published at like 6 a.m. Eastern time or something. So if you're an early riser, you'll be good to go even.
Awesome.
So I will make a plug real quick. I will be guest hosting for Chris tomorrow's In the Clouds with Marco Bill.
Mm-hmm. Marco Bill Peter.
Yes, thank you. Who is SVP of CX&O, Customer Experience and Operations. So if you have time tomorrow, please feel free to join. Would appreciate you being there. Otherwise, thank you so much, everybody. We will see you next week at the same time.
Bye all. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, everyone.